She stood in designer heels facing 10 years in prison, while the man she'd sworn to love and honor watched from the gallery, neither knowing she'd been playing the longest game of all. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. What happens when the person you trust most is part of that corrupt structure? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The gavel fell like thunder, sealing the fate of America's most decorated undercover prosecutor. But the real crime hadn't even been revealed yet. As her billionaire husband sat in the gallery, watching the woman he claimed to love get sentenced to 10 years for crimes she never committed, unaware that hidden in her arrest file was proof she'd been hunting him all along. Have you ever discovered the person you trusted most was your greatest enemy? Has someone you loved completely fooled you about who they really were? Do you know what it feels like when your whole world gets turned upside down in a single moment? This story will shatter everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and justice. Stay with me, because what happens next will blow your mind. She stood in designer heels facing 10 years in prison, while the man she'd sworn to love and honor watched from the gallery, neither knowing she'd been playing the longest game of all. The courthouse marble felt cold beneath Ariel Knox-Henley's feet as Judge Prescott's Alabama drawl cut through the silence like a blade. His weathered face showed no mercy as he stared down at the woman who had once been featured on magazine covers as half of America's power couple. Mrs. Knox-Henley, the judge's voice boomed across the packed courtroom. You stand convicted of felony obstruction of justice, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Camera flashes exploded like lightning from the media section. Every major news outlet had sent their top reporters. The fall of a Harvard law graduate turned federal prosecutor married to real estate mogul Blake Henley was the kind of story that dominated headlines for months. Ariel's hands remained steady at her sides. No trembling, no tears. Her dark eyes never left the judge's face, even as whispers buzzed through the gallery behind her. She wore a navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, but money couldn't buy her way out of this moment. Blake sat in the third row, his face pale as winter snow. The man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing looked completely powerless. His wife, the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, his secrets, was about to disappear behind bars, and there was nothing his wealth could do to stop it. 10 years in federal prison, Judge Prescott announced, his gavel raised high. No possibility of parole for the first 5 years. The courtroom erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Spectators gasped. Someone in the back row actually cheered, quickly silenced by disapproving stares. But Ariel heard none of it. Her attention was laser-focused on the bailiff approaching with handcuffs. She had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone could imagine. Every detail had been calculated, every possibility considered. Well, almost every possibility. As the cold metal clicked around her wrists, she turned slightly toward the gallery. Blake's eyes met hers across the chaos, those same green eyes that had first captivated her at Harvard 3 years ago. The eyes that had looked at her with such love on their wedding day. The eyes that now held nothing but confusion and heartbreak. Their gazes locked for exactly 3 seconds. In that brief moment, Ariel made a choice that would change everything. She mouthed 3 words that would haunt Blake forever. You taught me well. His brow furrowed in confusion. What did that mean? Taught her what? When? Blake had no idea what she meant. Yet, the bailiff tugged at her arm, leading her toward the side door that would take her to the holding cells. But Ariel wasn't thinking about prison. She wasn't thinking about the 10-year sentence, or the media circus, or even the handcuffs cutting into her wrists. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had with FBI agent Sarah Chun 6 months ago. A conversation about sacrifice, about the price of justice, about what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted. Remember, Agent Chun had whispered in that anonymous coffee shop, sometimes you have to lose the battle to win the war. As the courtroom door slammed shut behind her, Ariel allowed herself the smallest smile. Judge Prescott thought he had just delivered justice. Blake thought he had just lost his wife. The media thought they had just witnessed the downfall of a corrupt prosecutor. But none of them knew what was really happening. None of them understood that this wasn't the end of Ariel Knox Henley's story. It was just the beginning. What would you do if everyone you trusted turned against you at once? How far would you go to protect the people you love? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because this story is about to get even crazier. 3 years earlier, she was Harvard's golden girl with a perfect future mapped out until a Texas charmer walked into her criminal law seminar and rewrote every plan she'd ever made. Cambridge in October was a postcard come to life. Red and gold leaves danced across Harvard Yard while Ariel Knox hurried toward her advanced criminal procedure class, her coffee steaming in the crisp morning air. She had exactly 17 minutes before her constitutional law study group, 31 minutes before her law review meeting, and her entire life planned out to the minute. That was before Blake Henley walked through the door. "Good morning, future prosecutors," Professor Martinez announced. "Today we have a special guest. Blake Henley built a $100 million empire before his 30th birthday. He's here to discuss corporate restructuring and white-collar defense strategies." Ariel barely looked up from her notes. Guest lectures were usually boring rich guys trying to recruit cheap intern labor. But when Blake started talking, something in his voice made her pen stop moving. "Here's what they don't teach you in law school," he said, his Texas drawl carrying easily across the lecture hall. "The law isn't about justice. It's about power. And power isn't about money. It's about information." Now she looked up. He stood at the front of the classroom like he owned it, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her semester tuition. But it wasn't his clothes or his confidence that caught her attention. It was his eyes, green as summer grass and twice as dangerous. "Ms. Knox, right?" he said, pointing directly at her. "You wrote that article about prosecutorial discretion in white-collar cases. Brilliant work." Heat flooded her cheeks. She hadn't expected him to know her work, much less call her out in front of 60 classmates. "Thank you," she managed. "You argued that prosecutors should focus on systemic corruption rather than individual offenses." Bold position. What made you choose that angle? Every eye in the room turned to her. This wasn't how her Tuesday was supposed to go. "Because going after one person doesn't change the system," she said, finding her voice. "If you want real justice, you have to tear down the whole corrupt structure." Blake smiled, not the polite smile of a guest lecturer, but something deeper, something that made her stomach flip. "Exactly," he said. "But here's the question that keeps me up at night. What happens when the person you trust most is part of that corrupt structure?" The room fell silent. Even Professor Martinez leaned forward. "Then you have to choose," Ariel heard herself saying. "Justice or loyalty? Truth or love? You can't have both. Can't you?" Blake asked, his eyes never leaving hers. The bell rang, breaking the spell. Students began packing their bags, but Blake kept watching her. As classmates filed out, chattering about the lecture, he approached her desk. "Coffee?" he asked simply. She should have said no. She had study group, then law review, then her part-time job at the campus legal clinic. Her day was planned. Her life was planned. "Okay," she said instead. They walked to the coffee shop in Harvard Square, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up poor in Austin, about building his first company from a dorm room, about the loneliness that comes with success. She told him about growing up in Charlotte, about her pastor father who taught her to fight for justice, about her dreams of changing the world. 3 hours later, sitting across from him in a corner booth, Ariel realized something terrifying. Her perfectly planned life had just become completely unpredictable. "I have an internship program," Blake said as they prepared to leave. "Summer position at my Austin office." Interested, she should have asked about details. Salary, responsibilities, references. Instead, she heard herself say, yes. Later, walking back to campus, she would wonder if that impulsive decision was love, or if he had already started playing her. Have you ever met someone who changed your entire life trajectory in one conversation? Someone who made you throw caution to the wind? Tell me about that moment in the comments below. She came to Texas for a summer internship and found herself drowning in a world where $1 million handshakes happened over barbecue. and her boss made her question everything she thought she knew about right and wrong. Austin in June hit like a wall of heat and music. Ariel stepped off the plane into air so thick it felt like breathing soup, her Harvard sweaters suddenly useless in her suitcase. Blake met her at baggage claim, looking impossibly cool in the Texas heat, his smile bright enough to power the city. "Welcome to the real world, Harvard," he said, taking her bags. "Hope you're ready for a wild ride." His office occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown, with views of the Colorado River and the hill country beyond. But it was his penthouse apartment that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture that probably cost more than her parents' house, and a kitchen bigger than her Harvard dorm room. "This is where you'll be staying," he said, showing her to a guest room that was larger and nicer than anywhere she'd ever lived. "I can't stay here," she protested. "It's too much. Too expensive." Too what?" he asked, stepping closer. "Too nice for a preacher's daughter from North Carolina?" The way he said it wasn't cruel, but it stung. Because he was right. This world of marble countertops and wine that cost more than textbooks felt foreign and overwhelming. "I just don't want to owe you anything," she said quietly. Blake's expression softened. "You don't owe me anything, Ariel. You earned this internship, and I want you here." The way he said "want" made her pulse quicken. Her first week at Henley Enterprises was like drinking from a fire hose. She sat in meetings where people discussed buying and selling companies like trading baseball cards. She watched Blake negotiate deals worth millions with the same casual confidence most people use to order lunch. But it was the small things that seduced her. The way he remembered her coffee order. How he asked about her family during long car rides to client meetings. The nights they worked late and ordered takeout, talking about everything from Supreme Court decisions to their favorite childhood movies. "You're not what I expected," she told him one evening as they sat on his apartment balcony, Austin's skyline twinkling below. "What did you expect?" he asked, refilling her wine glass. "Someone colder, more calculating, more like the rich guys I've read about in case studies." Blake laughed, but there was something darker in his eyes. "Maybe you just haven't been paying close enough attention." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first raindrops began to fall. They should have gone inside, but neither moved. The storm rolled across the hill country toward them, lightning illuminating the sky in brilliant flashes. "We should go in," Ariel said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Should we?" Blake asked, standing and moving closer. Rain began falling harder, soaking through her thin blouse, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Blake reached up and touched her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. "I've been wanting to do this since that first day in your classroom," he whispered. When he kissed her, lightning cracked across the sky, as if the universe itself was responding to the electricity between them. She kissed him back with 3 years of pent-up focus and ambition suddenly redirected toward this moment, this man, this feeling she'd never experienced. They stumbled inside, soaking wet and laughing, his hands in her hair, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of his shirt. Everything she planned about keeping this internship professional evaporated like steam. But later, as she lay in his arms, listening to his heartbeat, a thought whispered at the edge of her consciousness. During dinner, she'd noticed something odd, invoices on his desk that didn't quite match the deals he described. Names on contracts that didn't exist in any corporate database she could find. When she'd asked him about it over wine, his explanation was smooth, practiced. Too practiced. "What are you thinking about?" Blake murmured against her hair. "Nothing," she lied, pulling him closer. But as thunder continued to roll across Austin, Ariel wondered if falling in love had been her choice, or if she was already being played by a master. When has luxury and love blurred the lines of who you thought you were? Have you ever ignored your instincts because someone made you feel special? Share your experience in the comments. Their wedding made magazine covers and society pages, but the most important guest wasn't on any list, doubt creeping in like an uninvited shadow. Charleston in April was pure magic. Magnolia trees bloomed like white clouds against the historic plantation house. Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like nature's own wedding decorations, and the string quartet played softly as 200 of the South's elite gathered to witness what the society pages called the wedding of the decade. Ariel stood in the bridal suite, adjusting her grandmother's pearl necklace over the custom Vera Wang gown that had taken 6 months and more money than her father made in 2 years to create. Through the window, she could see guests arriving, senators, CEOs, federal judges, and enough old Charleston money to buy a small country. "You look perfect, baby," her mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Your daddy would be so proud." Her father had died of a heart attack 6 months ago, just 3 weeks after Blake had asked for her hand in marriage. Sometimes Ariel wondered if the stress of seeing his daughter marry into a world he didn't understand had contributed to his death. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. Her college roommate, Sarah, recited, adjusting the borrowed bracelet from Blake's mother. But Ariel was thinking about something else entirely. The conversation she'd had with Agent Sarah 2 days ago at an anonymous coffee shop 6 blocks from the FBI field office. "Mrs. Knox Henley," Agent Chun had said, sliding a business card across the table. "We need to talk about your husband's business associates." The card was simple: FBI Financial Crimes Division. No name, just a phone number. "I don't know what you mean," Ariel had replied carefully. "Shell companies in Nevada. Cash transactions in Miami. Business partners with interesting criminal histories. Ring any bells?" Ariel's coffee had gone cold in her hands. "Blake runs a legitimate real estate business." "I'm sure he does," Agent Chun had said with a knowing smile. "But legitimate businesses don't usually need to launder money through Cayman Island accounts." Now, standing in her wedding dress with Charleston society gathering outside, those words echoed in her mind like a warning bell. The music began. Her mother kissed her cheek. The massive doors opened to reveal an aisle lined with white roses and 200 expectant faces. And at the end of that aisle stood Blake, devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, his eyes bright with love and excitement. When their gazes met, he smiled that same smile that had first captured her attention in that Harvard classroom. For a moment, all her doubts melted away. This was the man who remembered how she liked her coffee, who held her when she cried about her father's death, who had proposed on the beach in North Carolina where her parents had honeymooned because he wanted their love story to honor her family's history. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and tears and promises. When Blake slipped the ring on her finger, a 5-carat diamond that caught the light like captured starfire, she felt like the luckiest woman alive. "You may kiss your bride," the minister announced. Blake's kiss was soft and sweet and tasted like forever. But during their first dance, as the photographer captured every moment for posterity, Blake whispered something in her ear that would haunt her for months to come. "Now you're mine forever," he said, his voice low and possessive. She smiled and said, "Forever." But hidden in her bouquet, wrapped carefully among the white roses and baby's breath, was a small recording device that Agent Chun had given her just in case. The device caught everything, including the phone call Blake thought she couldn't hear during the reception, when he stepped outside to take what he said was a business call. "The prosecutor problem is handled," she heard him say. "Once she's family, she'll never testify against me." Have you ever ignored red flags because you were in love? What made you finally pay attention? Drop your thoughts below because this story is about to take a dark turn. 6 months into married bliss, a mysterious coffee invitation from Agent Sarah Chun would transform loving wife into undercover operative. But the biggest surprise was how natural the deception felt. The coffee shop on M Street looked like 1,000 others in Washington, D.C. Generic tables, overpriced lattes, and the kind of background noise that made private conversations disappear into the urban chaos. Ariel had been in the Capitol for a legal conference when Agent Chin's text arrived. "Need to discuss your wedding gift. Same place we met before. Come alone." She should have deleted the message. Should have gone straight back to her hotel and caught the next flight to Austin. Instead, she found herself walking through the door at exactly 2 p.m., scanning faces until she spotted the same sharp-eyed Asian woman who had disrupted her pre-wedding peace of mind. "Mrs. Henley," Agent Chin said, standing to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming." "I don't know why I'm here," Ariel said, but she sat down anyway. "Because you're smart." because you know something isn't right, and because that recording device in your wedding bouquet picked up some very interesting conversations. Ariel's blood turned to ice water. I don't know what you're talking about. Agent Shin smiled and placed a small tablet on the table between them. She pressed play. Blake's voice filled the space between them. The prosecutor problem is handled. Once she's family, she'll never testify against me. Interesting pillow talk, Agent Shin said quietly. Ariel stared at the device, her world tilting sideways. She had convinced herself she'd misheard that conversation, that her suspicions were just cold feet and pre-wedding anxiety. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "Your husband's company is a front for one of the largest money laundering operations on the East Coast. We've been building a case for 3 years, but we need someone on the inside. Someone with access to his files, his meetings, his private conversations. You want me to spy on my husband? I want you to help us stop a criminal organization that's stolen millions from pension funds, charity donations, and small investors who trusted them with their life savings." Agent Shin slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, elderly couples who had lost their retirement savings, families evicted from homes after investment schemes collapsed, children's hospitals that never received promised donations. "These are the real victims," Agent Shin said. "While you've been playing house in that Austin penthouse, real people have been losing everything." Ariel's hands shook as she flipped through the photos. A grandmother in a wheelchair, evicted from her assisted living facility. Twin babies in a hospital that had to close its cardiac unit because promised funding never arrived. "How do I know you're not lying?" she asked. Agent Shin reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Bank records, shell company documents, wire transfer receipts, everything we have so far." For the next hour, Ariel read through evidence that painted Blake not as the self-made millionaire she'd married, but as a sophisticated criminal who used legitimate businesses to hide illegal activities. The man who brought her coffee in bed every morning had been stealing from widows and orphans. "What would I have to do?" she heard herself asking. "Be yourself. Be his loving wife. Just keep your eyes and ears open. Document what you see. Record what you hear. And if he finds out..." Agent Chin's expression turned grave. "Men like your husband don't leave loose ends, Mrs. Henley. They eliminate them." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm, too dangerous. Ariel thought about Blake's smile, his gentle hands, the way he whispered, "I love you," every morning. "I need time to think," she said. "You have 48 hours, Agent Shin replied, standing. "After that, we move forward with or without your cooperation. But remember, you took an oath once as a prosecutor to seek justice. This is your chance to honor that oath." As Agent Shin walked away, her final warning echoed in Ariel's mind. Remember, the hardest part isn't getting the evidence. It's not falling deeper in love with your target. Could you spy on someone you love for the greater good? Where would you draw the line between love and justice? Tell me in the comments what you would do. She became the perfect trophy wife by day and federal informant by night, but the role that came naturally wasn't the one she expected. 2 weeks after her meeting with Agent Shin, Ariel Knox Henley had become someone she barely recognized. By day, she was still Blake's devoted wife, attending charity luncheons, hosting dinner parties, and smiling for photographers at gallery openings. But by night, she transformed into something far more dangerous, a federal operative with access to one of the biggest criminal operations in the South. The transition was terrifyingly easy. "You look stunning tonight," Blake said, adjusting his tie in their bedroom mirror. They were preparing for the annual Texas Business Council Gala, where hundreds of the state's wealthiest power brokers would gather to network and make deals worth millions. "Thank you," she replied, clipping tiny diamond earrings to her ears. What Blake didn't know was that those earrings contained recording devices so small they were invisible to the naked eye. The ballroom at the Four Seasons gleamed with crystal chandeliers and enough designer gowns to fund a small city's budget. Ariel moved through the crowd like she'd been born to this world, shaking hands with senators' wives and making small talk with oil heiresses. But her real focus was on the conversations happening in corners, the handshakes that lasted too long, the business cards exchanged with knowing looks. Mrs. Henley, a heavy-set man with expensive cologne, approached her near the bar. Marcus Webb, from Miami office. Your husband and I have been discussing some exciting opportunities. She smiled sweetly. How wonderful. Blake loves expanding into new markets. What she didn't say was that she'd spent 3 hours that afternoon researching Marcus Webb. The man had connections to shell companies in the Cayman Islands and a history of investment schemes that targeted retirement communities. Perhaps you and your lovely wife could visit us in Florida the next month, Marcus continued. I'd love to show Blake our operation down there. That sounds perfect, Ariel said, mentally noting every word for her FBI handlers. Later that evening, she excused herself to the ladies' room and quickly sent a coded text to Agent Shun. Miami meeting confirmed. Webb involved. Will accompany. When she returned to the ballroom, Blake was deep in conversation with 3 men she didn't recognize. Their body language was tense, urgent. Blake caught her eye and smiled, but something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? Fear? Gentlemen, he said as she approached. You remember my wife, Ariel. They shook her hand with the kind of politeness that felt rehearsed. One of them, a thin man with cold eyes, held her hand a moment too long. Your reputation precedes you, Mrs. Henley, he said. Former federal prosecutor, Harvard Law Review. Impressive credentials. Thank you, she replied, but warning bells were ringing in her head. Why would Blake's business associates care about her legal background? That night, as they drove home through Austin's empty streets, Blake was unusually quiet. Everything okay? She asked, placing her hand on his thigh. He covered her hand with his, but his grip was tight. Just thinking about some business decisions. Nothing for you to worry about. But when they got home, Blake immediately disappeared into his study and closed the door. Through the thin walls, she could hear him on the phone, his voice low and urgent. Ariel waited until she heard the shower running, then crept to his study door. The conversation was muffled, but she caught fragments. Knows too much. Potential problem. Handle it quietly. Her blood ran cold. Were they talking about her? She barely made it back to the bedroom before Blake emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, droplets of water still clinging to his chest. Come here, he said, pulling her against him. His kiss was desperate, hungry, like he was trying to memorize the taste of her lips. His hands tangled in her hair as he backed her toward their bed. And for a moment, she forgot about recording devices and federal investigations. This was still Blake, her Blake. The man who had fallen in love with a small-town preacher's daughter and made her feel like the most important person in the world. But as he whispered, I love you, against her neck, she wondered if those words were real or just another part of whatever game he was playing. When he fell asleep beside her an hour later, Ariel lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart racing. The microphone hidden in the lamp beside their bed had recorded everything, including Blake's phone conversation about handling problems quietly. Agent Chun had been right about one thing. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence. It was not knowing if the man she loved was planning to kill her. Have you ever had to smile and play along while your heart was breaking? When someone you trusted made you question everything you thought you knew about them? Share that story in the comments below. Every piece of evidence she gathered should have made her hate him more. Instead, she found herself understanding the man behind the crimes, and that terrified her. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Blake's phone buzzed against the nightstand, jolting them both awake. He grabbed it quickly, his voice hoarse with sleep. Hello. What? When did this happen? Ariel pretended to be asleep, but every nerve in her body was alert. Blake sat up, running his free hand through his hair. I'll be there in an hour, he said, then hung up. What's wrong? She asked, feigning sleepiness. Blake was already pulling on clothes, his movements sharp and anxious. Business emergency. I have to go to Houston. At 3 in the morning? He paused, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Raw, vulnerable, almost desperate. My business partner's son was in a car accident, he said quietly. He's not going to make it. The pain in his voice was real. Whatever else Blake might be hiding, his grief for a dying child was genuine. I'm coming with you, she said, starting to get out of bed. No. His response was sharp, then softer. No, baby. Stay here. This is going to be ugly, and I don't want you to see me fall apart. He kissed her forehead and was gone within minutes, leaving her alone in their king-size bed with nothing but questions and the sound of his car disappearing into the night. The next 3 days were the longest of their marriage. Blake called twice, short, strained conversations where he sounded exhausted and heartbroken. On the third night, he came home looking like he'd aged 5 years. "How is he?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him. "Gone," Blake whispered into her hair. 8 years old. He loved baseball and dinosaurs, and his voice broke. That night, Blake cried in her arms like a broken man. He told her about growing up poor in East Austin, about his father who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make rent, about the day his dad put a gun to his head rather than face another eviction notice. "I was 12, Blake said, his voice hollow. "I found him in the garage, blood everywhere, and I swore I'd never be poor again, never be powerless again." Ariel held him tighter, her heart breaking for the scared boy he'd once been. "Everything I've built," he continued, "every deal I've made, every risk I've taken, it's all been about making sure no one I love ever has to feel that helpless." "Blake, I know what people say about me," he interrupted. "I know what they think. But everything I've done to protect the people I care about. To protect you." The recording device hidden in their bedroom lamp caught every word, every confession, every justification for crimes that had destroyed innocent families. But lying there in the dark, feeling Blake's tears soak through her nightgown, Ariel found herself thinking not about the evidence she was gathering, but about the wounded man in her arms. How do you hate someone whose crimes come from love? How do you destroy someone who's already been broken by life? 2 weeks later, she was reviewing financial documents in Blake's home office when she found a folder marked charitable contributions. Inside were receipts for hundreds of thousands of dollars donated to children's hospitals, homeless shelters, and scholarship funds for kids from low-income families. The donations were anonymous. No tax benefits, no publicity. Just Blake quietly giving away money to help people who reminded him of his younger self. Agent Chun had warned her about this, about seeing the humanity in her target, about understanding that criminals aren't monsters, just people who made terrible choices for complicated reasons. But knowing the psychology didn't make the job easier. It made it nearly impossible. Is it possible to love someone and still do what might destroy them? Can good intentions justify terrible actions? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Their romantic getaway to Miami was supposed to be a second honeymoon, until Ariel discovered it was actually the biggest criminal meeting of Blake's career. South Beach in February was paradise. Crystal blue water, white sand beaches, and Art Deco hotels painted in colors that looked like cotton candy against the endless sky. Blake had booked them a suite at the Fontainebleau with an ocean view that took her breath away. "Just you and me for 5 days," he said, pulling her onto the balcony as the sun set over Biscayne Bay. No phones, no business meetings, no distractions. But on their second morning, while Blake was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text that changed everything. "Yacht party tonight. Marina Bert 47. Bring her." Ariel's blood ran cold. She quickly memorized the message before deleting it, her hands shaking as she replaced the phone exactly where Blake had left it. That afternoon, as they lounged by the pool, Blake casually mentioned that an old business associate had invited them to a party on his yacht. "Sounds fun," she said, adjusting her sunglasses to hide the fear in her eyes. The yacht was magnificent, a 100-foot floating palace called Second Chances that probably cost more than most people's houses. The party was already in full swing when they arrived, with beautiful people in designer clothes, sipping champagne and pretending to enjoy each other's company. But Ariel recognized several faces from FBI surveillance photos. These weren't just wealthy socialites. They were money launderers, tax evaders, and investment schemers from across the Southeast. Blake, Marcus Webb appeared with a drink in each hand and that same oily smile from Austin. "So glad you could make it." And the beautiful Mrs. Henley. "Thank you for having us," she said, accepting a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking. Blake's hand found the small of her back, warm and possessive. "This is incredible, Marcus. You've outdone yourself. Wait until you see the real party," Marcus said with a wink. "Business associates only. Lower deck in an hour." Ariel's pulse quickened. The business meeting was happening on the yacht, right under her nose. Agent Chen had equipped her with a new recording device, a tiny transmitter sewn into the lining of her designer purse. An hour later, the party began to thin out. Casual guests said their goodbyes and left in expensive cars, until only about 20 people remained. All men except for Ariel and two other wives who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Ladies," Marcus announced, "there's a beautiful moon deck upstairs. Why don't you enjoy some champagne while we boring men talk shop?" The other wives immediately headed for the stairs, but Blake caught Ariel's arm. "Actually," he said, "I'd like my wife to stay. She has an excellent head for business." Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise, maybe even concern. "Blake, I don't think." "She's family," Blake said firmly. "She stays." The next 2 hours were the most terrifying of Ariel's life. She sat beside Blake at a polished conference table while 20 of the most dangerous white-collar criminals in America discussed their operations like CEOs planning a corporate merger. Shell companies in Nevada, money transfers through Switzerland, investment schemes targeting military veterans and elderly retirees. The scope was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from people who could least afford to lose it. And Blake was at the center of it all. "The beauty of our system," he explained to the group, "is that every transaction looks legitimate. Small amounts from hundreds of sources, filtered through charitable foundations and real estate investments." Ariel forced herself to nod and smile, but inside she was screaming. This was the man who cried in her arms about wanting to protect people. The man who anonymously donated to children's hospitals. The cognitive dissonance was making her physically sick. When the meeting finally ended, Blake was energized, almost manic with excitement. Back in their suite, he pulled her onto the bed, kissing her with desperate intensity. "You were perfect tonight," he whispered against her lips. "I'm so proud of you." As they made love with Miami's lights twinkling outside their window, Ariel's recording device captured everything. Every word of the criminal conspiracy, every detail of their money laundering operation. But it also captured something else. Blake whispering, "I love you," like a prayer, like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to humanity. When has someone you loved completely shocked you with who they really were? How do you reconcile loving someone with hating their actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. She thought she was hunting him, until the night she realized the trap had been set for her all along. The evidence was damning. 3 months of recorded conversations, financial documents, and first-hand testimony that could put Blake and his associates away for life. Ariel had done her job perfectly, maybe too perfectly. That's why Agent Chen's phone call at midnight made her blood freeze. "We have a problem," Chun said without preamble. "Someone knows." Ariel sat up in bed, careful not to wake Blake sleeping beside her. "Knows what? About you. About the operation. Someone leaked your identity to Blake's organization." The phone slipped from Ariel's trembling fingers. She caught it just before it hit the floor. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Only 3 people knew. You, your supervisor, and me." "4 people," Chun corrected grimly. "Someone else has been watching this operation from the beginning. Someone with access to classified files." Ariel crept out of the bedroom and into the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've been played, Mrs. Henley. This whole operation, your recruitment, the evidence gathering, even your marriage, someone orchestrated all of it." The kitchen floor felt unstable beneath her feet. "My marriage. Think about it," Chun continued. "What are the odds that a Harvard law student specializing in white-collar prosecution would randomly meet a criminal mastermind? That he'd fall in love with her? That she'd be perfectly positioned to go undercover?" Ariel sank into a chair, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "You're saying Blake knew from the beginning?" "I'm saying someone wanted you to think Blake was the target. But what if he wasn't? What if you were?" Before Ariel could respond, She heard footsteps in the hallway. Blake appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair messy from sleep, wearing only pajama pants. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, squinting in the dim light. "Wrong number," she said, quickly hanging up. "Couldn't sleep, so I came to get some water." Blake moved closer, his eyes more alert now. "Are you okay? You look upset." "Just tired," she lied, but Blake knew her too well. He reached for her phone, which was still in her hand. "Let me see." "Blake, don't." But he was already looking at the call log. Agent Chin's number was listed simply as SC, but Blake's expression changed instantly. "Sarah Chun," he said quietly. "FBI Financial Crimes Division." Ariel's world collapsed in that moment. There was no point in lying anymore. "Blake, I can explain. You've been recording me," he said, his voice hollow. "For months. In our home. In our bed. The people you're working with are criminals. And you're a federal informant married to one of them." Blake ran both hands through his hair, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" That's when his phone rang. Blake answered it on speaker, his eyes never leaving Ariel's face. The voice on the other end was cold, mechanical, disguised by electronic distortion. "Mr. Henley, the prosecutor has been neutralized. Phase 2 is complete." Blake's face went white. "That wasn't supposed to happen yet." "Plans change," the voice replied. "She knows too much. Clean it up." The line went dead. Blake stared at the phone, then at Ariel, his expression a mixture of horror and heartbreak. "They want me to kill you," he whispered. "Blake." "They set this up," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "All of it. Our meeting at Harvard, the internship, our marriage. They needed a federal prosecutor close to the operation, so they created one." "Oh," she asked, though part of her already knew. Blake's phone buzzed with a text message. He showed her the screen. "You have 6 hours. Make it look like an accident." The sender was listed as Judge P. Judge Prescott, the man who would eventually sentence her to 10 years in prison. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was someone else's plan? If the person you loved was supposed to kill you? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story is about to explode. The FBI raid came at dawn, but the agents weren't there to extract their undercover operative. They were there to arrest her as a criminal. The sound that woke Ariel wasn't Blake's alarm or the neighbor's dog barking. It was the distinctive crack of a battering ram slamming into their front door, followed by shouts of "FBI! Search warrant!" She jolted awake to find Blake already sitting up, his face grim but not surprised. "Blake, what?" "Get dressed," he said quietly. "Now!" Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs as Ariel threw on the first clothes she could find. Blake was pulling on jeans and a t-shirt with the mechanical precision of someone who had prepared for this moment. "Blake Henley, Ariel Knox Henley, come out with your hands visible." They emerged from their bedroom to find their house swarming with federal agents wearing tactical gear and pointing assault rifles at their chests. Agent Chin stood in the hallway, but her expression wasn't that of someone extracting an undercover operative. It was the look of someone who had come to arrest a criminal. "Ariel Knox Henley," Chin announced in a voice loud enough for the news cameras gathering outside. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." Ariel's legs nearly gave out. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "You have the right to remain silent," Chun continued, pulling handcuffs from her belt. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is insane." Ariel struggled as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. "I'm working with you. I'm the informant." Agent Chin leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There is no informant. There never was. You're just another criminal who got too greedy." Blake was also being arrested, but by different agents. As they passed each other in the hallway, their eyes met for what might be the last time. "I'm sorry," he mouthed silently. But Ariel saw something else in his expression, something that looked almost like relief. The perp walk was a media circus. News vans lined their quiet street, reporters shouting questions as agents led them to separate squad cars. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks as Ariel was pushed into the back seat, her designer pajamas and handcuffs creating the perfect image of a fallen prosecutor. Mrs. Henley, did you know about your husband's criminal activities? How long have you been laundering money? Do you have anything to say to your victims? The car door slammed shut, cutting off the chaos. Through the window, she watched Blake being loaded into a different vehicle. He looked back at her once, his face a mask of anguish and resignation. At the federal detention center, they were processed separately. Ariel's mugshot would be on the front page of every major newspaper within hours. Her fingerprints were already in the system from her days as a prosecutor, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on anyone. In the holding cell, she finally understood the scope of what had happened to her. The evidence Agent Chun had shown her months ago, bank records, wire transfers, shell company documents, it was all real. But it had been altered. Every transaction now showed Ariel's involvement. Every shell company had her signature. Every wire transfer bore her authorization codes. Someone had spent months building a meticulous case against her, using her own undercover work as the foundation for framing her as a criminal. But the most devastating blow came when her court-appointed attorney arrived with a box of evidence the prosecution planned to use against her. "I have to ask," the lawyer said carefully, "did you really think you could steal $47 million and get away with it?" Inside the box were documents she had never seen before, financial records showing systematic theft from charity accounts, investment fraud targeting military veterans, and money laundering through offshore accounts. All of it bearing her forged signature. All of it creating a perfect portrait of a corrupt federal prosecutor who had used her position to steal from the people she was supposed to protect. In the bottom of the box was a note written in familiar handwriting. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, but you were always expendable. Judge P, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? When everything you believed turned out to be a lie? Tell me in the comments how you survived that kind of betrayal." Federal prison was supposed to break her. Instead, it became the place where Ariel Knoxenley discovered who had really orchestrated her downfall. The concrete walls of Coleman Federal Correctional Institution felt colder than the courthouse marble where she'd been sentenced. Ariel's cellmate was a tax evader named Rosa who had been locked up for stealing money from her church's building fund. "First day's always the hardest," Rosa said as Ariel sat on the thin mattress that would be her bed for the next 10 years. "But you look like you've got fight left in you." Ariel wasn't sure about that. 3 months of legal battles had drained her savings and destroyed her reputation. Every news outlet in America had covered her story, the corrupt prosecutor who married into crime and got caught stealing millions. But on her second week inside, everything changed. A guard handed her a manila envelope during mail call. No return address, no postmark, just her name written in block letters across cheap paper. Inside was a single photograph that made her heart stop beating. It showed Judge Prescott shaking hands with Blake outside a restaurant in downtown Austin. The timestamp read 6 months before she'd ever met Blake at Harvard, before their chance encounter in that criminal law seminar. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Look deeper. The rabbit hole goes all the way to Washington." That night, lying in her narrow bunk while Rosie snored in the bed above her, Ariel replayed every moment of her relationship with Blake. The way he'd seemed to know exactly what to say to capture her attention. How he pursued her with just the right amount of charm and vulnerability. The timing of their wedding, right after her father's death when she was most emotionally fragile. It had all been planned. But by whom and why? The answer came 2 days later in another anonymous package. This one contained photocopies of bank records showing payments from an offshore account to Agent Sarah Chun. Payments that started 3 months before Chun had first approached Ariel about becoming an informant. Chun wasn't running an FBI operation. She was running a private scheme. The third package arrived a week later with the most shocking revelation yet. DNA test results showing that Blake wasn't really Blake Henley. His real name was Michael Torres, and he was the son of a federal judge who had been murdered 12 years ago while investigating government corruption. Everything clicked into place like pieces of a deadly puzzle. The real Blake Henley had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Michael Torres had stolen his identity and built a criminal empire using information he'd stolen from his father's classified files before the judge was killed. But someone else had been pulling the strings all along. Someone who needed both Michael and Ariel destroyed to cover up an even bigger conspiracy. The fourth package contained a USB drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book. When Ariel managed to access it using the prison library computer, she found video files that changed everything. Judge Prescott meeting with senators. Wire transfers between government accounts and shell companies. Recording of phone conversations discussing the elimination of federal prosecutors who were getting too close to the truth. Her father hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered because his daughter was about to marry someone who could expose the entire operation. The final video on the drive was the most devastating. Judge Prescott giving orders to have Ariel framed for crimes she never committed, using her own undercover work as the foundation for building a case against her. The prosecutor thinks she's hunting criminals, Prescott said in the grainy footage. She has no idea she's been marked for elimination since the day she graduated Harvard. Rosa found her crying over the computer keyboard at 2 a.m. "What did you find, girl?" she asked gently. "The truth," Ariel whispered. Finally, the truth. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. And from inside a federal prison, proving anything seemed impossible. Until she remembered something Blake had whispered to her on their wedding day. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out who you really are. What would you do if you discovered your entire life was built on lies? How far would you go to expose the truth, even from behind bars? Share your thoughts below because this story isn't over yet. The most dangerous enemies aren't the ones you can see. They're the ones wearing badges and black robes, hiding behind the very system they've sworn to protect. Ariel's breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, her prison job assignment. The warden had placed her in the law library, probably thinking it was cruel irony to make a disgraced prosecutor help other inmates with their legal research. But the law library gave her access to legal databases, case files, and most importantly, a computer with limited internet access. Working nights when the library was empty, Ariel began building her real case. Not the defense she should have mounted during her trial, but an investigation into the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. The offshore account that had paid Agent Shun trace back to a company called Justice Solutions, LLC. On paper, it looked like a legitimate legal consulting firm. But digging deeper into corporate filings and tax records, Ariel discovered Justice Solutions was owned by a network of shell companies, all leading back to the same source. Judge Prescott's wife, Helen Prescott, the same woman who chaired the Federal Judiciary Ethics Committee. Over 3 months of meticulous research, working 2 hours each night after lights out, Ariel uncovered a conspiracy that went far beyond money laundering. Judge Prescott, Agent Shun, and at least 6 other federal officials had been systematically eliminating prosecutors who got too close to their operation. Her father had been investigating similar cases when he died. So had 3 other prosecutors who had suffered heart attacks, car accidents, and suicides over the past 5 years. But the most shocking discovery came when she cross-referenced Blake's real identity with the murder of Judge Torres 12 years ago. Michael Torres had been 17 when his father was killed. The official report claimed Judge Torres died in a home invasion, but Ariel found evidence that he'd been investigating the same conspiracy that had eventually destroyed her. Michael hadn't been working with Judge Prescott. He'd been working against him. Everything she thought she knew was wrong. The criminal empire, the money laundering, the Miami meetings, all of it had been Michael's attempt to gather evidence against the people who killed his father. He'd stolen Blake Henley's identity not to become a criminal, but to get close enough to the real criminals to bring them down. And he'd married her because he needed a federal prosecutor who could legally access evidence that would otherwise be classified. But Judge Prescott had discovered Michael's real plan and turned it against him. Instead of allowing Michael to expose the conspiracy, Prescott had used Ariel's undercover work to frame them both, eliminating 2 threats with 1 carefully orchestrated prosecution. The anonymous packages hadn't come from a mysterious ally. They'd come from Michael, using contacts he'd made during his years building fake identities and moving through criminal networks. He was trying to help her from whatever prison they'd sent him to, giving her the pieces she needed to see the bigger picture. On a cold Tuesday in February, exactly 1 year after her arrest, Ariel finished compiling her evidence. She had documented proof of murder, conspiracy, judicial corruption, and FBI misconduct involving some of the most powerful people in the federal government. But she also had a problem. She was a convicted felon in federal prison with no credibility and no allies. Until Rosa made a suggestion that changed everything. "My nephew works for the Washington Post," Rosa said during their evening conversation. "He's one of those investigative reporter types, always looking for big stories about government corruption. Why would he believe anything I tell him?" Ariel asked. "Because I've been watching you work for months, girl. You don't build a case like this unless you're telling the truth. And my nephew knows when someone's got the real goods." That night, Ariel wrote a letter that would either expose one of the biggest conspiracies in federal law enforcement history or to get her killed in prison. She mailed it to Rosa's nephew with a simple message: "Print this story, or they'll kill me before I can tell it myself." Have you ever had to trust a complete stranger with your life? When everything depends on someone you've never met believing your word over powerful people who want you silenced. Tell me in the comments what you would do. Sometimes the truth needs more than evidence. It needs someone brave enough to publish it, and a public willing to listen. The Washington Post story hit like a nuclear bomb on a Tuesday morning that would reshape American justice forever. Federal conspiracy, decorated judge accused of orchestrating prosecutor murders screamed across the front page in letters so large they could be read from space. Rosa's nephew, investigative journalist David Martinez, had spent 3 months verifying every document Ariel had sent him. The story had everything: corruption, murder, romance, betrayal, and enough documented evidence to bring down a dozen federal officials. Judge Prescott's response was swift and predictable. He called a press conference within hours, standing behind a podium draped with American flags, his wife at his side, looking appropriately concerned. "These are the desperate lies of a convicted criminal attempting to escape justice," he announced to a room full of cameras. Mrs. Knox Emily was found guilty by a jury of her peers after a thorough investigation. This is nothing more than a last-ditch attempt to avoid accountability for her crimes. But David Martinez had anticipated this response. His follow-up article, published the next day, included something Judge Prescott hadn't expected: video evidence. The grainy surveillance footage showed Judge Prescott meeting with Agent Shin 6 months before Ariel's arrest in a parking garage outside Washington, D.C. The audio was poor, but lip readers confirmed they were discussing the prosecutor problem and permanent solutions. Cable news exploded. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. Every network led with the story. Legal experts debated whether a sitting federal judge could be charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Social media turned Ariel into both a villain and a hero, depending on which side of the political spectrum people fell on. The real breakthrough came when other victims started coming forward. Families of the 5 prosecutors who had died under suspicious circumstances over the past decade began demanding new investigations. The widow of Judge Torres, Michael's father, held a press conference revealing that she'd been threatened into silence 12 years ago. "They told me my son would be next if I pushed for a real investigation," she said through tears. "I've been living with that guilt ever since." Inside Coleman Federal Correctional Institution, Ariel watched the coverage from the prison common room, surrounded by inmates who suddenly saw her differently. The woman they'd known as a corrupt prosecutor was now being called a whistleblower and a political prisoner. But the story that changed everything came from an unexpected source: Blake Henley himself. Or rather, Michael Torres. From his own federal prison in Colorado, Michael had been watching the media storm unfold. 3 days after the Washington Post story broke, he agreed to his first interview with 60 Minutes. "I loved her," he said, looking directly into the camera. "That wasn't part of the plan. I was supposed to use her to get evidence against Judge Prescott. But somewhere along the way, Protecting her became more important than getting revenge for my father. The interviewer pressed him about the criminal activities Ariel had documented during their marriage. Everything she recorded was real, Michael admitted. I did build a money laundering operation. I did work with criminals. But every dollar I stole went into a fund for families of murder prosecutors. Every crime I committed was designed to get closer to the people who killed my father. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. The only real crime I committed was falling in love with the woman I was supposed to betray. The interview shattered what was left of the government's case against both of them. Public opinion shifted dramatically overnight. Protesters gathered outside federal courthouses demanding new investigations. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Most importantly, other federal agents began coming forward with evidence they'd been ordered to bury or destroy. Agent Sarah Chun, facing her own criminal charges, agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the full scope of Judge Prescott's operation and implicated 4 senators, 2 FBI directors, and dozens of other officials. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into every level of federal law enforcement. But for Ariel, watching from her prison cell, the most important moment came at the end of Michael's 60 Minutes interview. I want to tell Ariel that everything I felt was real, he said. The love, the marriage, the future we planned together. That was the only true thing in a life built on lies. And I'm sorry it took destroying both our lives to finally tell the truth. What would you do if the person who betrayed you was also the person trying to save you? When love and deception become impossible to separate. Share your thoughts below because this story is about to reach its conclusion. The same courthouse that had condemned her was about to become the stage for the biggest legal reversal in federal history. The emergency hearing was called for a Friday morning, exactly 18 months after Ariel Knox-Henley had been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. This time, she walked through the courthouse doors not as a convicted criminal, but as a key witness in the biggest corruption case the federal system had ever seen. The media circus was even larger than during her original trial. News vans lined the streets for blocks. Protesters carried signs reading "Free Ariel Knox-Henley" and "Justice for Judge Torres." The courthouse steps looked like the site of a political rally rather than a legal proceeding. Judge Patricia Williams, specially appointed from outside the district to avoid conflicts of interest, had spent weeks reviewing the evidence that David Martinez's investigation had uncovered. The documents filled 17 boxes and included testimony from 43 witnesses. Ariel wore the same Navy suit she'd worn to her sentencing, but everything else had changed. Her legal team now included some of the most powerful attorneys in Washington, all working pro bono on what they called the case of the century. Judge Prescott sat at the defendant's table, his hands shackled, wearing an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from his judicial robes. The man who had sentenced her to a decade behind bars now faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder, judicial misconduct, and racketeering. Agent Sarah Chun had already pled guilty and was serving as the government's star witness. Her testimony over 3 days had systematically dismantled every aspect of the case against Ariel. Mrs. Knox-Henley was never an informant. Chun admitted under oath. She believed she was working with the FBI, but I was operating independently, gathering information to frame her for crimes she never committed. The prosecution's case against Judge Prescott was devastating. Financial records showed payments from his wife's accounts to contract killers. Phone records placed him at the scene of 2 prosecutor accidents. Video surveillance captured him meeting with known criminals who specialized in making murders look like natural causes. But the most damaging testimony came from Michael Torres himself. Transported from his Colorado prison in shackles, Michael walked into the courtroom looking older but determined. When he took the witness stand, the room fell completely silent. Judge Prescott killed my father because Dad was investigating corruption in the federal judiciary, Michael said, his voice steady and clear. For 12 years, I've been building evidence to prove it. Meeting Ariel wasn't an accident. I was supposed to use her prosecutorial access to gather classified files. But I fell in love with her, and that changed everything. Under cross-examination, Prescott's attorney tried to paint Michael as a master manipulator who had fooled everyone, including his wife. Did you or did you not operate a criminal enterprise that laundered millions of dollars? The attorney demanded. I did, Michael replied without hesitation. Every crime I committed was designed to get close enough to Judge Prescott's operation to gather evidence. Every dollar I laundered went into accounts that were frozen and returned to victims once the truth came out. And your marriage to Mrs. Knox Henley was just another part of your criminal scheme? Michael looked across the courtroom to where Ariel sat at the prosecution table. Their eyes met for the first time in 18 months. My marriage was the only honest thing I did in 10 years of living a lie, he said quietly. I love my wife. That was never part of anyone's plan. Judge Williams called a recess, but everyone in the courtroom knew the case was over. Judge Prescott's conspiracy had been exposed down to the smallest detail. The evidence was overwhelming, corroborated by multiple witnesses, and supported by financial records that couldn't be disputed. When court reconvened, Judge Williams delivered her ruling with the gravity the moment deserved. The court finds overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy to obstruct justice, commit murder, and frame innocent individuals for crimes they did not commit, she announced. All charges against Mrs. Ariel Knox Henley are hereby dismissed. Her conviction is vacated and expunged from the record. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Ariel's mother, who had flown in from North Carolina, sobbed in the front row. Reporters rushed to file stories about the biggest judicial scandal in American history. But Ariel only had eyes for one person. Michael was being led away in shackles, back to the prison where he still faced charges for his undercover crimes. As he passed her table, he stopped and mouthed the same 3 words she'd said to him 18 months ago. You taught me well. This time, she understood what he meant. Have you ever watched justice finally prevail after years of injustice? When the truth comes out and changes everything. Tell me in the comments how it felt to see the good guys finally win. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning the case. It's finding out who you really are when everything else has been stripped away. 6 months after Judge Prescott was sentenced to life in federal prison, Ariel Knox Henley stood in the visiting room at the Colorado Federal Correctional Institution, waiting to see her husband for the first time as a free woman. The room was nothing like the movies portrayed, just plastic chairs, fluorescent lighting, and the constant hum of conversations between inmates and their families. But when Michael Torres walked through the door wearing prison khakis instead of shackles, Ariel felt her heart stop the same way it had that first day at Harvard. You look different, he said, sitting across from her at the small table. Prison will do that to you, she replied, then immediately felt stupid for the comment. They sat in awkward silence for several minutes. Where do you start a conversation with someone you've been married to for 3 years, but barely know? I read your book, Michael finally said. Ariel had spent the past 6 months writing The Verdict of Betrayal, her account of the conspiracy that had destroyed and ultimately saved their lives. It had hit the bestseller list within 2 weeks and was already being adapted for a Netflix series. What did you think? She asked. You were too kind to me, he said quietly. I destroyed your life. You saved my life, she corrected. Without those anonymous packages, I never would have discovered the truth. Michael reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. Physical contact was limited during visits. I have something to tell you, he said. Something I couldn't say during the trial because it would have compromised the case. Ariel's pulse quickened. After everything they'd been through, there were still secrets? The day we met at Harvard wasn't an accident, Michael continued. But it also wasn't entirely planned the way everyone thinks. What do you mean? Judge Prescott did order me to get close to you. But I was already planning to approach you because of your father's work. Dad had mentioned Pastor Knox in his notes before he died. Your father had been sending him information about suspicious deaths in small-town North Carolina. Ariel's world tilted sideways. My father was investigating them too. Your father was the one who first discovered the pattern of prosecutor deaths. When Judge Prescott had him killed, I knew I had to find his daughter. You were the only person left who might be able to help me prove what happened to both our fathers. So even the conspiracy had a conspiracy within it. Her father hadn't died of a heart attack from stress about her marriage. He'd been murdered because he was getting too close to the truth about federal corruption. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I fell in love with you, and I wanted at least part of our relationship to be real. If you'd known from the beginning that we were both trying to solve our father's murders, you never would have been able to become the woman who could take down Judge Prescott." The visiting hour was almost over. Soon, a guard would announce that time was up, and she'd have to leave him here for another month until her next visit. "Michael," she said, using his real name for the first time, "when you get out of here, I'm not getting out for 7 more years, Ariel. You shouldn't wait for me. I already waited 18 months. What's 7 more years?" He smiled then, the same smile that had captured her attention in that Harvard classroom, but somehow deeper and more real than it had ever been. "You sure about that, counselor?" "I'm sure," she said. "Besides, I got a law practice to rebuild and a story to tell. And when you get out, we're going to do what our fathers died trying to do." "What's that?" "Fix the system." The guard announced the end of visiting hours, but neither of them moved for several seconds. "Ariel," Michael said as she stood to leave, "do you think we can make it? After everything that's happened?" She looked at the man who had lied to her, manipulated her, and ultimately saved her life through the power of love that had become real despite being built on deception. "We already have," she said. Walking out of the prison into the Colorado sunshine, Ariel Knox felt something she hadn't experienced since that day at Harvard when a stranger had changed her entire life with a single question. Hope. The story that began with betrayal had become something else entirely, a love story disguised as a legal thriller, a tale of justice delayed but not denied, and proof that sometimes the longest con of all is the one you play on yourself when you discover that your fake love was the most real thing you ever experienced. What would you do if you had to rebuild your entire life from nothing? If you discovered that love could survive even the deepest betrayal? Share your final thoughts in the comments below, because this story, like all the best love stories, is really just the beginning. The end.